That's true.
So yeah, man, like the basic question I wanted to just kind of get your insight. How do you feel about urban history today? How do you see the field? You've built so much of it for all of us. Where do you think we're at right now?
Well, let me just say, there's urban history as a fact that there's a history. There are the cities, and there's a history, whether we study it or not. So I think, and then there's the study of urban history, which I've been part of. But I think we need to remember the context that most people don't realize that we really live in an urban nation. Um, we were, Richard Hofstadter once famously said, the United States was born in the country and has moved to the city. Well, that's partly right. But what we don't understand, and even Hofstadter didn't pick it up, was that in the 19th century, not the only story of the United States, but a major story of the United States was rapid urbanization. Only Great Britain in all the world urbanized more rapidly than the United States in the 19th century. Our image, of course, is cowboys and Indians and wide open spaces. And that's true. I'm not saying that's not true. I mean, that's a part of American history too, and an important part. But by 1900, just in the 19th century, we went from 5% to, more than 35%. But places, I mean, New York is already the second largest city in the world. Chicago, which didn't even exist in 1830, is now one of the largest cities in the world. Places like Denver, probably Minneapolis, that almost didn't exist in 1800, now are important cities. And that's been, and then in the 21st century or 20th century. So in the 19th century, we went from 5% to 40% roughly. In the 20th century, really, I know there's a rural population and there are people out there, but really most Americans live in metro areas of 1 million people or more. So they may technically live in a small town. Right now, I'm technically in a small town called Chappaqua, New York, but it's part of metropolitan New York City. And anybody who thinks it is an independent place, it's dependent on God, on Manhattan. But anyway, so I think the groundwork is that urbanization has been important in the United States almost from the beginning. And obviously the first settlements, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, those were all, you get off the boat, you don't head into the woods, that's scary. So I think that's worth mentioning. But we didn't study cities in a systematic way until really World War II or afterwards. There were, of course, cities, and I don't mean there was nobody writing about cities, but not
Not many.
systematically.
Yeah.
It was emphasis was on governors and senators and wars and international politics and things like that. And there's, there was it was mostly the stuff that was written about cities, and there were books about cities, tended to be boastful, how Pittsburgh became the greatest city or stuff. One of the first was a woman named Bessie Louise Pierce, who was at the University of Iowa in the pre-interwar period, never married to my knowledge, but the University of Chicago they were kind of inventing urban sociology at the time between the wars. And they persuaded her to leave Iowa to come to the University of Chicago to write a systematic, serious history of Chicago. Let's don't do one of these things. Let's really do the history of Chicago. Well, be careful what you want in life because you just might get it. And they got it. And she finished 4 volumes and I think only got to 1900 or around there. And she was good at it. I'm not saying it's not, but it's really not the kind of thing that's people are going to rush to buy and read 4 volumes on the history of Chicago. In fact, she was sorry about that kind of background noise.
Okay.
But she was actually losing ground. It was taking her more years to write history of first quarter of a century and the 20th century than it took her to write it. No, she took more years to write it than it was. So she tried to get me to work for her when I first got to Chicago. But she was one. But I think the real pioneer was Richard Wade, who wrote a book called The Urban Frontier, which was about the first part of the 19th century in a sense, the lower Midwest, Pittsburgh to St. Louis, including Cincinnati and Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, St. Louis. There's another one on Louisville. Also,
yeah.
Lexington was in there, even though it really wasn't on the Ohio River. And to talk about, contrary to popular thought, frontier was not led by individual farmers. It was these settlements, like Louisville and St. Louis. They were in advance of the settlement, really. Somebody to open a grocery store or something. And it was an important book, not really a page turner, but very influential in its reorganization of the way America was settled. Opposite Frederick Jackson Turner and the frontier thesis, that it wasn't farmers out there first. There had to be a little settlement somewhere.
Yes.
Anyway, that was important. But probably what was more important about Richard Wade was that he was a kind of a Pied Piper. So his influence was all through his teaching. He left to he got his PhD, I think, at Harvard, worked at the University of Rochester for a while, went to Washington University in St. Louis for a few years, and then was persuaded to come to the University of Chicago, where from about 1963 till 1970, only 7 years really, he probably had as big effect on American history as any professor before or since in just 7 years.
Wow.
Because he persuaded people, I was one of them, that I never thought about urban history anymore than I thought about bicycles. I mean, yeah, there's a city, but and he was passionate about it. He really felt that we've done enough about senators and governors and wars and diplomacy. How about talking about where people lived and how they lived? And that's what he did. He trained probably a dozen historians then who went on around the country: Stanley Buter, Stanley Schultz, Zane Miller at Cincinnati, Roger Lotchen at North Carolina, me at Columbia, Stan Schultz at Wisconsin. A lot of people. And so he kind of changed. And that was a big subject and I happened to be lucky enough to be on the front end of it. I happened to get my PhD just as places like Columbia thought, whoop, we don't have an urban historian here. We need something. So
nice.
I got lucky in life, not just with my marriage, but with timing. And of course, a lot of life is timing and luck.
Sir.
And so anyway, so I came to the University of Chicago and as one of his people and kind of taught urban. That's what they wanted me to do. I mean, I love military history too, but Columbia wanted, and then I taught what became the biggest course at Columbia, which, well, first it was urban history, but it really became New York City.
Yeah.
It had hundreds and hundreds of people in it. And I did lots of walking tours because I believed that if the city is important to us and it's right outside this window, there's this huge city, why don't we get down in it and see it, looking for ourselves? And so I started doing with this walking tours, and then I thought, can't cover much ground on foot. And so I rented buses all day. And then Manhattan is not made for 50 passenger buses going down narrow streets. So I began to emphasize the Bronx and Harlem because they were close to Columbia, and I could start the tour right away and then get to the South Bronx, which at the time was probably the most distressed part of the United States. No longer is, but anyway, it was for me.
Certainly was, yes.
And then I started riding my bicycle. I'm not a bicyclist, and I wasn't into, but I just thought, and I was teaching a seminar at the time. I thought, why don't we just ride a bike? We can cover a lot more ground. And somewhere I read about a bike ride. I want to say it was in Baltimore. It had nothing to do with the college, but somebody was doing it all night. It wasn't my idea to ride at night. But I thought, well, I'll just try that. I didn't ask anybody for permission. I said, I'm going to go riding. You want to go with me? And let's say a dozen people. And that was fun in those early years, in the early 70s, because I could look down a street and first of all, you didn't have to worry about one-way streets. It's only a dozen of you, and say, that looks interesting. Let's go down and see that. Well, by the
Yeah.
time it was in the 21st century, and I have 200 or 300 people with me.
Ooh.
You had to know where you're going. You can't go
Yeah.
down the street. And the whole thing has to be planned out ahead of time. It's not fun anymore.
Oh,
But it became, for me, it's
yeah.
actually just because I had to go places I'd already been and seen. And the heavy responsibility was, suppose somebody is hit by a taxi at 3 in the
Of
morning
course.
and becomes a quadriplegic.
No. Yeah.
What fool took hundreds of students out in the middle of the night in this dense city? Anyway, I didn't ask, and it just got bigger and bigger. And luckily, in 40 years of doing this, I only had one young lady who, down in the cobblestones of the near the Federal Reserve Bank and Chase Manhattan Bank, it was kind of cobblestones, and her front wheel flipped over, had some 7 stitches in her chin, but her boyfriend was with her and took her to the hospital. Anyway, she was fine. In 40 years, that's the only thing I had.
That's amazing. That's miraculous.
And you know, in America, because people are crashing into each other, you got so many people. So there were people who fell, including me, but I mean, you weren't hurt, you know. And so anyway, I became kind of famous at Columbia for this all-night bike ride because it became kind of a Columbia event.
Yeah.
And I had people who literally got married who met on the bike ride because it's a wonderful time to start chatting with somebody. And people remembered it. You know, who knows what I said on a particular day, but if they went on the bike ride and it's been 30 years and they live in Tucson, Arizona, they still remember the bike ride.
Yes, indeed.
So, you know, it's an experience, and I think experiential learning has got something to teach us a little bit. Anyway, because of Richard Wade and some other people, he wasn't the only one. He probably was the most prominent. There was an explosion of interest in cities by academics after 1965, I would say. Stan Bass Warner, who was not a Wade student, but wrote a book called Streetcar Suburbs about Boston. He published in 1962. It's called Streetcar Suburbs, The Process of Urban Growth in Boston. It's the process of urban growth. In which it's not a biography of a mayor or something.
No.
It's thinking about, why does the city look like? Why are all the houses, 3-deckers or whatever they are?
Yes.
And he examined real estate. It was kind of a new way of looking at sources, a new set of questions. And then other people began to look at political bosses. That's an American phenomenon, because what we also don't realize in the United States is that cities are important. How would I say this? Logistically, politically, governmentally, in the sense that the mayor of Chicago, for example, has power, real power, and New York. Whereas in Tokyo, you cut ribbons, or London. That was the tradition in those places, or Moscow, big cities. It wasn't so much that the cities had independence, but they were part of the larger government. In the United States, our tradition, we have 20 nuclear powered aircraft carriers around the world, and we're known for our military, but we're a very decentralized country. I know Donald Trump is trying to change that at the moment, and I'm against it. But that's a characteristic of the United States. It is local, and a lot of functions are at the urban level. And so let's think about the political boss. This is a study that a lot of people have done. Zane Miller, Boss Cox of Cincinnati, the Tammany Hall in New York. I mean, there are lots of famous things. And to look at why the boss comes from New York. I mean, from the United States. First, he's got power. Second of all, you're a dirt poor Irish or Italian immigrant or something else. Nobody gives a flying damn about you. You get to a big city, and then you find out that there's a ward boss somewhere. His name is Big Tim Sullivan, and you find out that he can get you a job.
Yep.
He actually can find you a job, and you go into his clubhouse, and he wants to say hi. He wants to reach out his hand to shake your hand. Here you are nothing. You are a dirt
Mhm.
on some hill of Italy, and in Ireland, you had nothing to do with government. Here's a guy with power shaking your hand. What can we do to help? And he had, of course, three guys behind him. He would assign, take care of Walter here.
Yes.
Need some work. Well, they were building subways and doing all sorts of other things. They needed workers, and they had strong backs.
Hmm.
He would do that, but the key part of it is, I'm not just doing you a favor, Walter. I want you to do something for me.
That's right.
And that
Exactly
is,
right.
when the election comes, I not only want you to vote, I want you to help me bring some doorbells and get some people out there.
That's
So
it.
they built these 30, 40,000 person machines who turned out to vote. And they didn't want it to be a general election for the president the same day. What do we want? A low turnout. It doesn't matter if there's a blizzard outside.
Control it.
Our people are coming. I know
Hmm.
there's a push in New York to put the election of the mayor with the election of the president. And that's not it wasn't a good idea for the machines.
No.
But anyway, that's an American thing that most Americans don't realize. The growth of cities is another important topic. I taught for a while at UCLA just as a visitor. But UCLA on one hand seems, now when I was out there, hardly anybody was writing. Robert Fogelson wrote a book, The Fragmented Metropolis,
Yes.
which is important. He taught at MIT. I think he's not still doing it. But that was one of those topics, is look at how it grows. Here's a huge difference. In Europe, the streetcars were not allowed to companies to invest in real estate.
Mm.
States you could. So we're going to run these streetcars out into empty land because we're going to sell land.
That's right.
You can get there. And so they became part of the American pattern. And Sam Bass Warner shows how it happens in Boston, which is not the most sprawling city. Turned out LA has
Mhm.
great cars, and they have a terrific public transit system for a long time. It spreads out. Although LA, which is more like New York than most people realize, it's much more dense than most American cities. It's really 3-story apartment buildings with a parking garage on the ground floor. I lived in one. But why that happens, how the water system in LA, how the people who ran the LA Times invested or got the city to build an expensive pipe to the Owens Valley.
Mhm.
And suddenly the valleys the famous Valley Girls in LA, that was worthless land. It was desert. And
Yeah.
that's water.
Mhm.
Look at what's happened in Los Angeles. Now they're running out of water. So clearly historians, now they're turning their attention to water.
Yes.
Because we're not going to have any more water. And if the 20th century was about oil, 21st century is very much likely to be about water, because we're not getting any more of it. But there's so many new topics that historians have begun to undertake in those years. Another would be social mobility. That was really hot in the 1970s and late 60s. Steve Thernstrom, who was at Harvard for years, led that, looking at Newburyport, Massachusetts. The problem was his study. That was the only city in the United States that was declining between 1850 and 1880. But nevertheless, he could write well. He could anticipate it was a good book. And that led to a lot of other studies of social mobility in Omaha, in New York, in other cities. And Ted Hertzberg was part of that. Stuart Blumen did a lot of that kind of work.
Yep.
And then there's more work. I mean, just think of all the things in cities. Tim Dolan, I think it was Tim Dolan, who wrote a book called The Immigrant Church, about New York from 1800 to 1860. But it didn't focus on the hierarchy. It didn't focus on the cardinals. What impact did this immigrant church had on these poor people who nobody else gave a crap about?
Yeah.
And he talked about how the national parish, they had parish for Irish people, and maybe a block away a parish for Germans. They were willing to modify their beliefs, and they created parochial schools because they didn't want their kids to. Guy named, I can't remember, John, can't remember. It's the first big important Catholic bishop in New York. Fought for independence. But anyway, it's those kind of questions that people hadn't so much thought about before. They had thought about it in a different way. Or Tim Guilfoyle.
Yes.
Well, Tim, well, he thought, a city is where a lot of things happen, and some of them, well, there's just a big trial in New York today of Walter Diddy or something like this,
Yeah.
sex trafficking. But anyway, that didn't start in 2025.
No.
This has been back as long as they've been human beings, and cities were famous for this. And Tim Guilfoyle was he wrote a book called City of Arrows, which is about prostitution in the big city. But geographically, where are the brothels? You know what I mean? Those kind of, it wasn't about the actual sex.
No.
It was about the business of sex and how it affected the city and the politics of the city and such things as that. I'm wandering off, but I want to just say one more thing. This finally discovered that African Americans had a major impact on cities. Really, before the Civil War, Richard Wade wrote another book called On Urban Slavery in Charleston, and how the first Black communities were on the edge. Because anyway, I won't get into that because it's not that important in the city. But it was kind of where do they live? Where does immigration start? And like Alan Scher, I think, who was at the University of Minnesota, the Scher, I think Scher,
yeah,
book called Black Chicago, and how the first Blacks who up there in the 19th century was sort of a little bit more integrated and doing okay. And then we got this huge migration following the Illinois Central Railroad, going through the Black Belt in Mississippi and Arkansas and West Tennessee, where I'm from, Memphis, and then on up through Illinois to Chicago. Suddenly there was a huge influx of Black citizens.
Yes.
And the previous Black citizens not thrilled about this because they overwhelmed them. And a lot of them said, well, you're Black. That's all that matters to me.
Nah.
So anyway, so the history of housing in cities and segregation and attempts at integration became, I think, important. I had a little part to do with that. I wrote a book on the suburbs.
That's a bigger contribution than you're letting on.
Well, whatever. But part of it was to see how the federal government, look, in some ways, most of us racist, you try not to be, but you are, but you do expect a little bit better of the government, not to follow our petty prejudices. And what I found, looking at FHA records and homeowners loan corporation records, if you're looking at St. Louis, and you couldn't do this very easily, but with St. Louis, because the county and the city are separate.
Yes.
They had, the government didn't want to do it. They had to separate those statistics. And you can see that the vast percentage of FHA homeowners were going to the county, which is more white, and the city, and even home improvement loans went to the, and then now I did a lot of work on Newark, New Jersey too. Same kind of thing. Especially any Black neighborhood is going to be, by definition, red. There were four colors: red, yellow, green, blue, and then green. Green was money, and red was danger. So, did they do, for historians, even though they were jerks and clearly racist, but they had these federal appraisers in the 1930s when we created the Homeowners Loan Corporation, FHA, to rate neighborhoods, because they said it's not only whether you have a job and you can pay your mortgage every month, but we have to know what's going to happen to the neighborhood. Well, so they set up these standards. First of all, what we call a grid plan, what do they call it? A waffle iron.
Yes.
Where streets are straight. That's not good. They didn't like it. They wanted to have streets that are curving. And that's one thing. And so you're more likely to find that not so much in Newark, but in the suburbs of Newark. Yes. They wanted to have mixed uses. That means you wanted an Italian delicacy. I have an apartment I had in 82nd Street in New York. And I would have people come over and say they wanted vodka and something. And I didn't have it, or I didn't have something, without even telling them we would have a dinner party. I'd run down the steps, run to a
Mhm.
grocery store right on the corner, buy whatever, come back. They never knew I was
Come
there.
back right.
That was invaluable. So what you would see as an advantage in Manhattan, the federal appraisers thought that's definitely a no-no. You
Yeah.
want single uses, only resident. Another thing, not inharmonious racial or ethnic groups. Well, we know what that meant,
Uh-huh.
you know. And so quite frankly, you can go, anybody can go look at these maps. I was the first one to really pure luck.
That's
Uh,
exactly right.
Back at the time, I was just wandering in the stacks of the National Archives and saw something that said residential security maps. I wasn't looking for that, but somehow maps, somehow, part of it's luck, but part of it's got to be prepared to take the luck and pulling them down and seeing these huge maps of every neighborhood. And they were all in these colors, red and blue and
Mhm.
green and red, yellow, blue, green. Yeah. And you didn't have to spend very much time with those maps. And then they had backup because each neighborhood had a code like C was
Mm.
yellow and six was the six yellow neighborhood. And then
Mm.
you had this incredibly detailed who lives there, what's the racial makeup, the ethnic makeup, what's the houses made of, what do they cost, are there any kind of inharmonious problems in the neighborhood? Well, there it
All there.
goes. And they did this, and they published books. I mean, it was not a secret that I found.
No.
This was this was official, and well, and we've gone through some iterations in American history in the last half century since then. But what I think we found was that it's not like God intended that Newark would be poor and Darien, Connecticut would be rich. They're both kind of suburbs of New York City, but decisions that human beings make.
Yes.
And if you do the right thing, in the sense, let's say the moral thing, and you build public housing for the people in your community that need it, you just shot yourself in the foot. Because Newark builds a lot of public housing, and therefore you get a lot of poor people.
Mm-hmm.
Darien doesn't have the problem of public housing at all. They just don't apply for it, don't need it. And that's why you have this strange situation where in the United States, where public housing is associated with cities, mostly unsuccessfully, especially high rises.
Yeah.
New York City is an exception there, but it's not a natural thing. I mean, those are political decisions, and and you don't have to be a Republican or a Democrat to say how did the world that we live in get built, and you can argue about how to solve these issues, but I do think that attention to them is not. And there are lots of things which I have that's cultural. I want.
Mm-hmm.
I thought cultural was, the opera, the symphony, the theater, museums. That was kind of icing on the cake. That wasn't really made cities. Well, I was wrong.
Yeah.
I
You
realized
start digging into it.
really, I mean, actually, what is a city other than and people want to come, and the culture is actually now I realize it's a huge economic driver in
Yes.
in urban areas, and that's why they want to have a Minnesota Historical Society and institutions, art museums, and things like this that attract people not only to help your own local citizens, but they tend to be in the center of city. Not always, but that's where they tend to be because for historic reasons, that's where they were put. And in COVID, when people stopped going to cities and our museums and institutions suffered, we know that when tourists stopped coming, we took an economic hit. And I think we're not going to make that mistake again.
Yeah.
Every city that has any ambitions.
Well, I want to jump in this piece. You've given this.
Speaking of which,
Yeah.
I'm going to just hang up. That's Stanley Buter calling. He was
Oh,
the first generation of urban historians. He was a
wow.
Richard Wade student. He wrote a book on Pullman, which is a kind of a suburb at 110th Street of Chicago, where this guy who invented the Pullman sleeping car made his factory and wanted to make that a model town.
Mm.
It's still there. That's
Wow.
what's wonderful about cities. You're
Yes.
teaching in Chicago. Let's go to Pullman. Let's look at it, and anyway, that book was published in 1967, so that's 67 years ago or 68 years ago,
My
and
goodness.
still an important book. And he's still kicking. He's
That's the
90 something
piece.
years old now. Most of us have gone on to our rewards, but he's not.
No, but that's the thing. So I really thought of having this conversation because I teach so much of your work, and so many of the people you've mentioned, I continue to teach those works, especially as methods, especially as how do people find the body of evidence? How do you decide what you can say based on the evidence that you found? And that has been an inspiration to me as a student and now as a faculty member. But I wanted to really hear from you as someone who has shaped so much of this and led the way. Um, it's gone through a massive transition. And so now so much is digital. People are using these online tools so much. And there's been some good effort to digitize the
Yeah.
resources and to make primary sources available, but there's still so much more. And you can see the difference in the attention span for students coming up, that they're not going to sit in the archive. They have to have years of training to do the kind of work that you've always done.
Right.
And so I wanted to see what you're thinking about this moment that we're in, when we have multiple generations of professional urban historians who have brought this gift to the moment, but it's a different challenge to reach the next generation.
I agree with you absolutely, Walter. It's so much easier to do things. I remember when I was working, I did a first book on the Ku Klux Klan in the
Hmm.
city, and I traveled around to Detroit and to Indianapolis and to Atlanta and to other places, Chicago, um, working on it. And then I wound up at the New York Public Library, which is one of the great libraries in the world.
Yes.
And looking in the old card catalog, it's, I wonder, what have I been doing all this traveling around? They had all these things here I hadn't even seen. But now that's all digitized, most of that kind of stuff. So you don't have to go. It's easier. That speaking of urban history now, um, uh, a guy named Mike Wallace got the
Hmm.
Pulitzer Prize for a book on New York, biography of the city, with
Hmm.
co-author, and he goes to Mexico and works on the book. Because he can access everything on the internet and stuff like.
Hmm.
He's ill now, so I don't think you have to still be able to sit in front of a computer. But so that may be over. But he's done, three, and maybe the last one will be the fourth wonderful volumes, a third volume on New York. Um, but I think there's another change going on. There are two changes going on at once.
Hmm.
Somehow cities are not quite as sexy as they used to be, in part
Hmm.
because there's been a huge interest in cities, and people realize they are important. And so now I think gender issues are
Hmm.
probably, so there are other things, but I don't think the interest in cities are going to go. The great advantage history has over political science and anthropology and sociology is history exists whether we study it or not. It's
Yes.
not just it's not an academic construct. It's there, and
Yes.
cities are there, and the way we live, and even the way we have farms in the United States, is different from Europe and places like that, where people would have villages and they would go out in the daytime to the farms, but they lived in villages often. Where we have this isolation, where you know 4 farms to a square mile or something like that.
Yeah.
And it is a rural isolation in the United States that you didn't. So I think we, to understand our past, in a way, we need to look at ordinary people and the way in which the, the government at all levels impacts their lives, and in the ways in which we hope we can improve on it. I'd like to think that things are getting better, that it's not as bad. Um, well, just to give you an example, I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, which is in the Black Belt.
Hmm.
Segregation, separate water fountains, everything else. But I can remember when Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi, not only would not have black members on his teams, they didn't want to play against a team, Memphis State, that had played against a team, University of Cincinnati, that had black players. That's
Oh
how
my
crazy it
goodness.
was.
Yeah.
Now, turn on the TV, Ole Miss's entire basketball team is black. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? So I don't mean that that's the most important thing,
No.
but also elected officials in Mississippi and places like that. It's just the North has as much to explain as the South, I think, in some
Indeed.
ways now. And of course, there's a reverse migration going on now. Chicago, which is really the black, I mean, when you say black metropolis, you really, I guess, you mean Chicago. New York always had more blacks, but another much smaller percentage.
Yep.
And Chicago's losing its black population
Yes.
to the suburbs, maybe to Atlanta or Memphis, and even New York. It's unbelievable that a Muslim could
Oh
be
yeah, the
look like
nominee.
the Democratic nominee for mayor, and probably the big growth in population in New York is Asians
Yes.
and some Muslims and there's the black population. Harlem's less than half black now, so so there's still the changes are continuing, and the need for urban history is going to continue, and the need for us to understand our past is, I think, really important. I think it's I think I think our current president seems to know less history. He doesn't seem to understand it, which I think is a problem. I don't mean that he's maybe not at some level trying to do good, though I question it at times, but he's just not aware, I think, of all Muslim, even though his money is coming from his father, who was a good businessman, who was investing in real estate in Queens and places like that. So his money is, and then in Manhattan real estate, manipulating the government and stuff like this. So, I'm not, I just think it's good to understand it. And so that you don't make comments about history that are just blatantly exaggerations or sometimes just plain not true.
That's false.
And,
Yeah.
and I think one of the problems that urban history has now, and history in general, is that there's less agreement about truth. I mean, who's saying it? That's what everybody wants to know. We don't, and that's a problem with the internet.
Yeah.
I was president of the New York Historical Society, and we're coming up on the 25th anniversary of the World Trade Center disaster. I had letters from people saying it's a conspiracy. The reason they showed me that the airplane that hit the Pentagon wingspan was bigger than the hole in the building. The Jews blew up the World Trade Center, and that's why the Jews weren't in the World Trade Center. Or that it was blown up from the. I'm talking. There are people who believe it was blown up from the bottom. Didn't matter. You saw the planes. They blew up from the bottom. Well, there'll always be these people, but now there are fewer people to kind of correct it because you can find anything you want. And, there used to be, conservative and liberal magazines, but they had standards themselves, that were not terrible. But now there's no standard. You can just put anything on there you want that, and I think that's a problem for scholarship going forward. We have
Now,
to
talk much more because this is so
agree
important.
that there's a way to do things and a way to respect what you have done and a way to have and I think that's one thing graduate work in history especially teaches you. There are some facts there, and you can have your own interpretations, you can do it, but you can't create facts, like Trump said the other day that the United States won World War One. Well, yeah, it's true that right at the very end, our troops managed to stop the German thing. If anybody knows anything about war knows we didn't win World War One. And the Germans would have won if we hadn't intervened because they were much stronger than we were, or that we won World War II and they think the Red Army killed 4/5 of the German soldiers who died. Those are kind of basic facts. You kind of you need to have somewhere, because I actually spoke yesterday somewhere, and some young woman said, "Did Japan invade China in World War?" Well, in China they don't make that mistake. They remember. They really remember the rape of Nanking and stuff like this.
Yes.
Koreans have not forgotten, so they have a memory. And the Russians have, of course, not forgotten about World War II and the need for buffer states. I'm not saying they'll be right about what they want to do in Russia invading Ukraine or something else, but you kind of understand these people are coming from a place of terrible history.
Yes.
And 27 million deaths in one country is a bunch. You know what I mean? And I was at a cemetery, and I believe in studying other cities. He knows not
Hmm.
England, who only England knows. And the good news is, I think and one of the things I've tried to do in Crabgrass, not so effectively, but tried to put the United States in a world context and say it's just not a big, powerful country. At least at the time, it was a very unusual country with suburban houses and cars everywhere and home ownership and stuff like that. It's a little less unique than it was then, but still, it's important to know. Um, and policies at the federal level have a lot to do with the way we live. And anyway, I'm hoping that we will continue with a generation of students who care about other people, who think we are brothers keepers in some ways. I don't mean every way, and I'm a I don't believe communism works. I mean, some people want to sleep all afternoon, and some people want to carouse, and some people want to make money. Well, let them have but there needs to be a floor.
Yes.
There needs to be a ceiling, and I think for a long time, in the United States, we had those things, and I think we have lost our kind of national agreement that some amount of money is too much.
Hmm.
$1 billion or
And there's a minimum standard. Nobody should fall beneath.
and we owe everybody who is a citizen of the United States 3 meals a day,
Hmm.
place to sleep that's outside the cold. I mean, that's just and an education. We owe that. You're born here. This is our debt to you. And
Well, let me stop on that education point for a second, because Indiana University, the state of Indiana, its legislature, basically required, I think they slashed over 100 of their major and minor programs, and um, are looking at, faculty reassignment, redesign of their flagship institution. Like, how are you seeing what's happening? I mean, I would imagine Columbia has certainly seen, the real controversy over the last year or so. But what are you seeing in the way that higher education is being forced to change and to reimagine itself?
well, I really do worry because I really do think I just believe it, not just because I spent my life doing it. You need to understand how you got here. Why do I have a yard out in front of my house? What kind of a stupid thing is that? Doesn't feed any crops, doesn't nourish any animals. Where does this come from?
It's
You
decorative
know,
space. Yeah.
most of the world has no conception, China, of a yard. What is a yard? What is a friend of mine taught over and they read some part of Crabgrass and they had a question. They said, "What is it?" And I said, "What is crabgrass?" There's no such thing as crabgrass in China. The idea that you'd spend money on this worthless piece of real estate just to, well, Thorstein Veblen, who was not a historian, but who had a lot of influence on history, the theory of the leisure class. Well,
Yeah.
that's a perfect example of golf costs a lot of money to buy the clubs, it costs a lot of money to print it. So it shows you that I'm successful.
Hmm.
The yard shows you I got enough money, I can waste it on useless space. Um,
Hmm.
but I think history gives us context. David McCullough, not an urban historian, not even an academic historian, was
Hmm.
probably the best spokesman for history that we've had in my lifetime because
Hmm.
he believed it. He had an emotional attachment to it. And if he wrote about the Johnstown flood or the Great Bridge or whatever he was writing about, his words conveyed more than just some kind of detachment. This was real. This is life. And I think we need to hold on to that in history. When we get too quantitative, and we aimed that way in the 1970s, and I will say that sometimes I'm reading the American Historical Review, and my wife would be driving, and I'd be her son, and I'd read 2 or 3 pages, and I went, "What did I just read?
Read.
I
Yeah.
have no idea what it says." We kind of don't emphasize our ability to communicate.
Hmm.
We don't have to glorify anybody, not Hitler or anybody else, but to say that I almost wish we would have a history class and we say, "You've got to get a note from your mother to take this class because we're going to talk about real history, not
Hmm.
glorified history." history's not all pretty. You
No.
know, a lot of it's not. A lot of it we're embarrassed about. But that's what we're gonna deal with. We're gonna assume you're mature enough, and your mother can opt out. Said, you know, I don't want my child to know about discrimination or this or that. You know,
Mhm.
but I think that it's a real. And Indiana is a state that has emphasized history, has a great history department. You know, I wrote on the Ku Klux Klan, which had a major operation in Indianapolis, and and you know, but it is a trend everywhere, and I'm hoping it's a short-term trend.
Yes.
That it'll go back because, well, you know, now the unemployment rate among the STEM troops are pretty high too. You know, computer programs or people like that.
Yes.
Microsoft just today announced the layoff of 9,000 people. This is Microsoft. You know what I
Yes.
mean? Amazon's doing the same thing. They're saying, and I even though I wish I could be 20 years old again, I think they got some challenges that my generation didn't have. You know, the nuclear war
Yeah.
never happened. There were lots of jobs. Yes, there was a lot to be ashamed about, but you know, the most of we made a little bit of progress. It was an upward, sort of an upward trajectory. And
Sense
now
of
who knows
opportunity. Yeah.
whether we'll have a third world war, whether the jobs will be there. Um, but I don't think ignoring history is going to help us deal with it.
No, I'll tell you the most troubling thing I've had to adapt to in the last decade are college students who come in after years of training about school shooting drills where they feel just viscerally unsafe in the classroom, and just getting them to kind of believe that there's a point and there's a larger mission. And so there are these kinds of social consequences that are just overwhelming for young people, and just trying to get them to the place where they can begin to learn in powerful ways is its own challenge.
Well, I was from Memphis, Tennessee, as I think I mentioned, and it's always been have a high crime rate. It
Hmm.
has, for example, this is a fact, more homicides than New York City had, and New York City
Hmm.
is 15 times bigger, but you never know that if you watch the news. But I never heard of this high school shooting in high school. I remember once at my school in shop, that used to be a boys
Yeah.
subject where all the girls took home economics. In the shop, some student aggressively took off his belt at a teacher. I mean, police cars are landing on the school. He took off his
Hmm.
belt. He threatened
Hmm.
the teacher. Are you kidding me? Now that would be a belt. What can you do with
Yeah.
a belt? But it's become something that we almost expect. You know, they break in the news to say, and by the way, it doesn't happen much in cities. Another thing to learn from central cities is not only that I remember when there was the first shooting in Denver, Colorado suburb, maybe it was Columbine, I don't remember.
Yes, exactly right.
And on national TV, a woman was saying, this is not the kind of thing that happens in this nice suburb. It happens in the big heavens in New York. Well, it's never happened in New York.
Yeah.
But it tends to be white males between 15 and 25, you know, and then there's some other I don't mean everybody, but
No.
that's most of them. And and girls don't do it mostly, you know. We might as well, you know, so I think we need to know the facts. And nobody
Yes.
seems to be bothered with the facts anymore. Um, Minneapolis, for example, has always been a safe city, relatively safe and a clean city. You think of snow, they clear that snow off fast. You know,
Yes.
I'm saying that it does get cold, but they have this giant mall so you can go in and stay there for a few hours and do whatever
No,
you want.
it's a beautiful place, especially this time of year.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, no, I've asked the set of questions for you and you told us so much. Were there things that I've missed or things that you wanted to make sure other scholars, younger scholars, would think about going forward?
Well, I do think that we need to attract people to history. Um, go to cemeteries,
Mm.
ask students to reconstruct. Segregation, class, ethnicity, all those things are very apparent in cemeteries if you look at them carefully.
Hmm.
Um, I think go to Gettysburg. You
Yeah.
know, think about what happened. Think about it. It makes a difference. People's decision make a difference in a hugely important way. And that's just one of the examples. I think in an urban history, to take them out into the city, things are happening there. And I used to say, just go to a fire station and talk to them about the past. And older people on a bench, and try to reconstruct a neighborhood based on conversation with people who've been there and done that, and what have they experienced. I think to feel part of the city is important, and I think anything that makes you feel part of history is important. I think I don't love historic preservation, even though I spent my life looking at old buildings. I often thought, well, New York is really not about, you don't come to New York to see old buildings. I mean, if you want to see old buildings, there are better places to do it. But if you want to see, you want action, you want culture, you want stuff like that. That is, anyway, don't destroy the city. And they're just about to landmark the whole place. But that's an argument we can have. That's not,
Yeah.
And based on facts, and they're smart people who take the other side. I understand that. But I think that you need to see them. They're up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. There's a church now that wants to sell itself to a developer to put up high-rise apartments for tens of millions of dollars. And the landmarks people said, this is a historic building, but it's yours. You can't be a church anymore, but we're going to make it a landmark anyway. I think that's an issue because in many cities we need more affordable housing. That's an issue. And well, if you want the price of popsicles to drop on your block, sell some more popsicles, bring some more people to sell popsicles. We got to build more housing. The problem in the United States now is we're not building enough structures for people to live in. That's going to make the price of shelter go up, I think. And there are other issues, but we need to say that history is part of the conversation.
Yeah.
You can't understand what's happening now unless you understand how we got there. And anyway, that's what I would say is that's
yes, please.
I'm worried about people not loving history because I don't see how you can not love history. That's like not loving life. It's like you take the most exciting parts of life and you focus on them, and they're not all happy. I mean, Stalingrad's not happy. Iwo Jima is not a happy time, but it's important. And I think studying other cities, I mean, Japan has wonderful cities. And you could go to places like Japan and Korea, Germany, look at their cities, and then come look at cities in the United States and say, who won World War II anyway? It's not their civilization is better than ours. Well, how did that happen? How did it happen that, and now I think there's a slight move back to cities, interior cities. Not huge, but it's coming. But still, I used to go around the country talking about crabgrass frontier anywhere. I could go to Las Cruces, New Mexico, or you name it, Kokomo, Indiana, or Muncie, Indiana, and talk about past and future of metropolitan America, or past and future of the city, city. And I needed to get there 3 hours early. I needed somebody to show me downtown and the boarded up department stores. I needed to see the fanciest mall they had. I needed to see where the slums were, stuff like this, and just plug it in. There are some exceptions. New York's clearly an exception, and some places like Boston, and there are. And the United States is a little fuzzier than it was when I wrote Crabgrass Frontier, but still, there's an American pattern, even in Minneapolis. And I thought that was one of the things about Crabgrass Frontier that was, I thought, important, was that even in the cities that didn't have exactly the same racial and ethnic experiences of other cities, but they still spread out, out to the west in Minneapolis and stuff like that. So, so you got to think about a lot of different things. And the bad guys, some bad guys are still bad. But I mean, one of the impulses to write history is to try to sometimes write about a bad guy, let him say he wasn't.
Hmm.
You know, that's
You're
your
going
right.
to tell
I
as many
think you
stories as
write a
you can.
history, you write a serious history of St. Paul or any place else, that makes you an expert.
Yeah.
Give an opinion. You know what I mean? Give an opinion
Yes.
at the end of the day.
Yes.
You have to base it on facts, and you have to, the things that you cite as facts have to be right, but you can give an opinion anytime you want. So
I'm
anyway,
going to tell you one story as we start to wrap up this, man. I thought about this at the last AHA meeting. You got to give a talk in the evening. I forget if it was Friday or Saturday. I'm inclined to think it was Saturday. But I walked into the room. I was right on time, and I realized I had made a terrible mistake. I should have been 15 minutes early. There was barely any seats left. I had to find my way. And the first two rows were full of all your students who have gone on and gotten their PhDs and finished their books and are all extraordinary writers and scholars in their own right. And for you, I believe Tim was up on the panel with you, Tim Guilfoyle, to hear that conversation and to see physically the people gathered in the room to be there with you, um, it was just so striking and so moving for me. So thank you from me, and thank you from all the people
tell me
like
about
that.
your past, Walter. Where are you from?
Oh, a place you mentioned in Crabgrass Frontier at the very, very end, Manalapan, New Jersey.
Okay, okay,
So one
okay.
of these like distant exurbs way outside the city, almost midway
How
between
did you
New York
wind
and
up
Philadelphia.
in St. Paul? Where did you go to college?
Oh yeah, man. So Temple, I did undergrad at Villanova. I was thinking I was John Lewis and I wanted to have a civil rights experience, so I fought against a very, very conservative campus.
Beautiful
Did-
campus,
It's
great basketball coach.
amazing, amazing place. And I'm so thankful I'd made that choice in so many ways. But then my
Beautiful.
doctorate was Temple. I was at Temple in Philly with Ken Kuzma and
Okay.
Betty Collier Thomas, Wilbur Jenkins doing civil rights and urban history.
I knew Mark
Very close
Haller.
to
He may have
Joe
retired.
Trotter. I'm
Mark
sorry?
Haller. Did Mark Haller already retired?
Yes, he had already retired, but I got to work with Tom
Helen
Segru and
Davis.
Michael Katz over at Penn a good bit. So, like, just a great city to be in and begin to understand questions about cities. And of course, got very fortunate to come and work at Barnard and be around to Columbia for a couple years. That was with Jim Basker, and he was
Oh
doing
yeah.
that with, I guess, the works on abolitionism and anti-slavery. And that's where I got to meet you for the first time. And
And Jim Basker has been a real Pied Piper himself and made a big difference.
yes. Yes, so it's extraordinary, extraordinary crew of historians. And I guess I'm more determined to make sure our next generation picks up on these threads and follows them and
Well, I'm sure
carries them into the
you'll
future.
have an influence, and I'm glad that I just wrote a letter to a guy named Dan Doctoroff, who name doesn't mean much to most people. He was first deputy mayor under Mike Bloomberg, and
Mm,
I was jealous of him because he was very rich, very good looking, beautiful wife, wonderful kids. Um, First deputy mayor did all sorts of things. There's a huge book in his thing. I just went on a trip of and he's, by the way, I was jealous of him. He's got Lou Gehrig's disease, and
oh,
he's in the final stages.
yeah,
And you see, he knows what's going to happen, but he's 20 years younger than I am. But um, I wrote to him to say that on this boat trip with the rejuvenation of Brooklyn and the Brooklyn waterfront, and especially the west side of Manhattan, which was a dump, you know,
yeah.
40 years ago, and now it's
Oh, man.
very fancy and it's a booming place. And I said he had as much to do with that as Bloomberg did too, of course.
Hmm.
But I said you made a difference. Your life's made it, so you'll make a difference too. And I hope I made a little difference in some people's lives.
Yeah,
And I'm facing the end of it. And you have to understand, life has an end. And
man. I look at something like Richard Florida and the City Lab that is now on Bloomberg as a
yeah.
platform. None of that happens without you and the crew of historians that you've described. So, yeah, I'd hope more people will learn to appreciate how
But
hard this
if
work
they'll be
is.
like you, we're okay.
Yes, sir. I appreciate you. I'm going to stop the recording and then I'll send you once I